We've invested millions of dollars to build our businesses in compliance with California laws and regulations. We firmly advocate for the stringent testing mandated by the state to guarantee the safety and excellence of our products. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Sunday morning special report for High at 9 News. I'm your host, Jason Beck, and I'm joined today by Nate Winokur of Bell Costa Labs in Long Beach, California. Please make sure to smash that like button on your way in. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And this Sunday morning special report, we will be discussing the recent LA Times article in conjunction with Weed Week News. Titled, you guys, that's right, you guessed it, The Dirty Secret of California's Legal Weed. Where we have aging yuppies in neon beach water stand before a green wall with the catchphrase, "You have changed, so has cannabis." The social media post is part of a Real California Cannabis, a $5 million taxpayer-funded campaign to promote California cannabis as safe, tested, and regulated by the state to protect you, the consumer. In reality, that safety is far from certain. An investigation by the Times and Weed Week News in conjunction with the Cannabis Industry Newsletter found alarming levels of pesticides in cannabis products available on dispensary shelves across the state, including some of the most popular brands of vapes and pre-rolls in the weed game today. 25 of 42 legal cannabis products that the Times and Weed Week purchased from retail stores and had tested at private labs showed concentrations of pesticides either above levels the state allows or at levels that exceeds federal standards for tobacco. The contaminants include chemicals tied to cancer, liver failure, thyroid disease, and genetic and neurologic harm to users and unborn children, you guys. Most of the pesticides found were in low concentrations that risk long-term harm by repeated use, though the extent of the health threat may not be known for years, they say. Vapes tested from 5 well-known brands had pesticide loads that exceeded the Environmental Protection Agency's risk thresholds for harm from a single exposure. The Times and Weed Week found users might experience irritation to the lungs, eyes, and throat, as well as rash, headache, diarrhea, and abdominal pain. Some individual products contained as many as 24 pesticides, and the findings dovetail with scores of complaints that 2 private cannabis testing labs have failed over the last 8 months, reporting pesticides in products certified by other labs as safe. The results, the lab said, suggest some level of contamination in more than 25,000 vapes and pre-roll joints on store shelves, about the number sold legally in California in a day or two period. Man, oh man, oh man, it does not sound like anything that we are going to be purchasing on the shelf is going to be safe.
It's a interesting way to look at what the state of what's actually in the regulated industry, what it actually is. You kind of consider it to be something that you'd want to be safe, but in reality, there are just layers upon layers of what we can learn about how the state actually has things, how things are to be tested. The lab, for instance, for a flower batch, acquires 0.35% of that whole batch. That means 99.65% of that batch has not been tested or touched by that lab. What does that mean? That could happen to 99.65% of that batch. That hasn't happened to 1/3% of that same thing. Oftentimes, when we think about the realm of recalls, was there some kind of microbial presence that was missed? Maybe it was in one part of the batch, but not in that small sample subgroup. It goes further and really expounds the concerns that you might have as to how good of a job lab testing does, especially when you consider that A, there are bad actor labs out there, and B, that a lot of us in the industry kind of know who those bad actor labs are, and if the state's not necessarily enforcing on them at the time, we sort of see what the effect of that is. A lot of these batches that this article touched came from last year. And one could say that there's a difference in state enforcement between last year and this year that you could easily see just by the sheer number of recalls we've seen in 2024.
And so, just to preference, these were all tests from labs or tests that were taken last year. And so this, or
Maybe
basically
not all, but I haven't
prior to the
whole
state
list, yeah.
saying that only 6 or so labs, which your lab is one of the part of, that can test flower products.
That was a potency test standard. So this article specifically is pesticide testing. There's a whole world of awareness that I believe needs to be brought to that. But in that short list that you mentioned that was available at the beginning of the year, and thank you, we were fortunately at the top of that list. In that short list that was available at the beginning of the year, that was the effect of the state trying to standardize potency testing and try to make all labs essentially test flower
the same
potency
way. The same way.
Exactly.
Yeah. That way.
And so that way you actually, as a consumer, can get some kind of truth to the matter.
In all fairness, that's how most tests are standardized to operate in a standardized format.
That's how it should be in general.
That's how it's supposed to go. So, you got 10 different labs testing weed 10 different ways. It's not going to work.
Any agricultural product, for that matter, gets tested in the exact same way across the map, top to bottom. So what we have here, and I believe this article will cover, is also the notion that the state was about to roll out in the same way pesticide standards. And those pesticide standards have been something that the state has deliberately kind of set forward as something that's to be looming as a reality that labs are to be standardized by in the future, which makes sense. Again, another kind of standardization, but standardization for pesticides has not, as of today, stepped in yet. And many of these batches, again, coming from 2023, that notion of standardization, which came in at the beginning of this year with potency, was such a far cry from something that anybody was expecting in 2023. And so you have, in some ways, regulations catching up on a lot of bad actors, maybe in some senses some labs, and in some senses some people who had their hands on product, which rather than being disposed of or remediated in the proper manner, it was just made more financial sense to get that out the door with the least resistance possible. I don't want to speak for anybody, but again, there are numerous labs that one can go to, and myself out there, and as well as a couple of other decent ones, are going to be the only ones that might actually give you the straight dope about what you're wanting, about what you're testing, rather than reporting answers that you just want to hear, which may not necessarily affect future business between those two parties.
Interesting.
And so that kind of is a reality, and just wanted to sort of fit that in there as part of the landscape and how many of these companies are sort of looking at this historically.
Well, again, this is a pretty long article that we're going to cover in detail. But that is important things to know, especially going into the depths that this article is going to go into. But moving right along with the article, there are some strong profit incentives driving contamination. Expanding legal markets encourage intensive growing practices to increase yield, inviting the use of pesticides to protect those high-value crops from insect infestations common in greenhouse environments. At the same time, the soaring popularity of vapes has created a heavy demand for bulk oils, which are made from lower quality cannabis, often grown illegally, LA Times is saying. Reviews of confidential lab reports, public records, and interviews show California regulators have largely failed to address evidence of widespread contamination in the state's cannabis crop. The state's requirement for weed testing also have not been updated to include dangerous chemicals currently used in cultivation, including illegal, smuggled pesticides so toxic that law enforcement officers who encounter them are advised to wear respirators and take blood poisoning tests.
May I say something real quick?
Yes.
I visit 200 grows a year. I don't feel that's very accurate.
I don't feel that's very accurate either. I think that's a little bit of gaslighting or whatnot, but you know what? Project Sam always has to get their piece in, right? Fair enough. The health stakes from contaminated weed are high. An estimated 5 million Californians consume cannabis products in any given month, according to the most recent federal health surveys. The presence of pesticides is particularly fought for those who turn to weed for relief from medical conditions that put them at increased risk of harm, they say. Public long-term health concerns are exacerbated by the growing use of vapes, which contain the greatest contamination levels and are marketed to young adults who are more apt to consider vaping a healthful alternative to tobacco or alcohol. California Department of Cannabis Control officials declined to make anyone available for an interview. The agency also would not release either external or internal discussions of pesticide contamination and refused to release information on its ability to test cannabis products, saying such knowledge would encourage bad actors. Sounds like the state's a bad actor, but
things that make you say,
It would furnish the results of pesticide tests it had received from other state agencies and would not provide the safety certificates for cannabis products on the market. It also declined to say what action it has taken on at least 85 contamination complaints it has received since last fall from private labs, or disclose what tainted products it pulled from sale. In a quote, "When we receive complaints, we swiftly assess them, conduct appropriate investigations, and take appropriate action," the agency's press office said by an email. The agency is now scrambling to initiate California's first market test for pesticides, sending a recent email warning license holders of coming product embargoes, voluntary and mandatory recalls, and disciplinary actions. The private labs raising alarms for many months questioned why authorities did not act sooner. Now, Nate, as a lab operator, what are your thoughts in regards to this? I mean, to me, that the state dropped the whole ball by even having testing without having these types of standards in place, and they still don't have these standards in place today. So I don't understand what the even need for testing is in the first place.
When you suggest that the standards not being in place, it was very much trying to assist with a path of least resistance type of format. In that we're looking at something that people needed to study and something that was important mid-study to be able to start looking at what is in its way controlled results prior to the industry, without stunting the industry.
So they basically turned our industry into a guinea pig, is what you're telling me.
In many ways, because there's a lot of things that needed to be figured out, and rather than stunt the industry or withhold testing altogether, you have the opportunity to allow testing labs to get part way there. And when I say that, I mean there were certain requirements that were necessary, such as having an ISO standardization, an ISO accreditation rather, to certain standards for how a lab should be acting and how those methods should be developed, and the scientific method behind those, or the scientific process behind those methods be followed. So by forcing things like ISO involvement, method development, and so forth, you should be getting partway there, but you still leave yourself with the question, if you're allowing somebody to develop their own internal standard, how relevant is it to another's? And that's been the argument up until this point.
Well, it sounds like we're going to get more and more into that, because toxic chemicals in legal weed. Independent lab tests found 45 toxic chemicals in legal cannabis products, 29 exceeding either state limits for cannabis or federal tobacco standards. Below are 36 appearing at the highest levels. The degree to which they exceed state or federal limits and their known health effects list dangerous chemical toxins and their effects. Toxic peak is the number of times over a permitted limit, and less than 1% below the limit. As you can see on the graph, it has a whole little scoring thing, and you can see it's all color coordinated as well. Many of these chemicals are considered Category 1 pesticides by the state of California. And this is the designation that is used for the most toxic of compounds. Chlorinated pesticides such as chlorophyll, Cysophorus, or hold on, pause a second. I'm going to have Nate read these because I am going to murder these names, and I apologize to these compounds.
Chlorinated pesticides such as chlorphenapure, chlorpyrifos, those are both especially nasty. Chlordane in particular has been banned from use in the US for 40 years. Chlorinated pesticides like that are especially nasty, especially toxic. All are found on the Category 1 side of the panel, which means that even the slightest amount of detection for some of those compounds leads to a fail.
What type of chemicals that common cultivators would use? How would you get that? Like what products?
So the idea of having these pesticides is fairly common. You'd asked what type of products they come from. They're especially prevalent in concentrates. Oftentimes because the environments by which these products are grown have these chemicals in them, but at the end of the day, when you consider how a batch is tested, we gather so much cannabis, we homogenize that, and we test that for certain things such as pesticides. There is such a thing as those pesticides being below the limits of detection for a laboratory, and we might not outright see it. But some of those Category 1 pesticides we talked about a moment ago, even the slightest bit of detection leads to a fail. And what we can see in these kind of conditions is that there are certain products like concentrates where through concentration, not only have you concentrated cannabinoids and terpenes and everything else you might want, you also have concentrated pesticides. And it's actually possible to take certain pesticides from non-detectable amounts into fail amounts just through concentration.
Wow. Wow. Man, that's a lot to digest. We're going to keep this train rolling. California cannabis regulators initially responded to those complaints with a single product recall, and in orders that remain confidential, required 3 other products to be removed from store shelves. Frustrated that more was not done, Josh Swidler, the chief executive of Infinite Chemical Analysis Labs and author of most of the complaints in December, sent his summary of contaminated products directly to Governor Gavin Newsom and the cannabis regulators in an email. Those failing products alone represented 150,000 packages of flower, vapes, or pre-rolls for sale to unsuspecting consumers, he wrote. The government's responsibility does not end after writing regulation, he says. After Swider sent his letter, an additional product was recalled for pesticide contamination. The remaining tainted batches were left to sell out. Meanwhile, licensing files show the state's seed-to-sale inventory system contains faulty data, including missing crops, misidentified products, and safety tests that don't match the goods sold. Testing is done by state-approved independent labs, but no state-run lab is accredited to test for pesticides. There is no routine testing for the chemicals in products on store shelves, putting California out of sync with best practices adopted by the California Regulators Association. Do you want to touch on that for a second, Nate?
Yeah, the idea of regulation for a lot of these products is something that in some ways, when you consider the state stepping in and still standardizing, that would be the end-all be-all. There are a lot of existing methods out there for cannabis testing, which have been found to be not acceptable at best, not repeatable, not good science. In a lot of cases, having a well-to-do lab that means well, that has access to chemical standards, which we all do, to be able to import these chemical standards so that our instruments are able to identify and quantify these various chemicals that we're looking for, and then to be able to adequately search for those, calibrate our instruments to those constantly, and to be able to report what we find is well within reach of the common cannabis lab.
Yeah.
The fact that many labs have chosen not to do this as a means of expanding or keeping a market is a big part of where a lot of these concerns have come from.
Big part of the problem right
and
there.
You can say that standardization is important because at that point, really, it is a true apples to apples scenario. But there are levels of, if you will, of standardization. For instance, we all, again, have access to the same chemicals. We can all calibrate our instruments to those same chemicals. To a certain point, with a well-to-do lab and trying hard, there shouldn't be an exception to what they're doing. Lastly, they need to report to the state that they're able to test everything within the range that the state has required us to test, which means that they've run tests to suggest internally that they are able to repeat data, that they are able to test adequately for these same compounds. So it's not like one lab possesses this amazing ability and another lab doesn't. Standardization is nice because that's the same rule book.
Yeah, all labs should be created equal.
That's correct. And standardization is a part of that.
That's part of that.
But short of having a perfect standardization, we all have access to the same chemicals, and it's all very clear what we're supposed to be testing for, and we've all reported to the state that we can test adequately for those chemicals. And that's a huge sign of what's essentially being overlooked and how some labs just kind of went F all, and that's how it went.
Well, moving right along, those gaps leave policing of the industry largely in the hands of labs, just like what Nate was referring to, financially beholden to the companies whose products they test.
Well put.
Legislation to require independent fraud and accuracy checks has remained stalled in Sacramento for 2 years amid backroom negotiations between industry players and regulators. In a quote, California is dropping the ball on enforcement where public health is concerned, said cannabis researcher Cindy Orsher, a former director of a private California cannabis testing lab. Then there's testing for harmful chemicals in regards with all of this, you guys. California requires cannabis products to be tested for 66 pesticides. That list, unchanged since 2018, has not kept pace with current cultivation practices. Tests conducted for the Times and Weed Week identified 7 off-list pesticides in legal products on store shelves. One brand of vape contaminated contained, go for it, Nate.
Fenvalerate.
Fenvalerate, a fungicide proven to lower sperm counts and prohibited in the United States since 2008. 16 products contained.
That's pymetrozine. Pymetrozine.
Pymetrozine, an insecticide known to cause liver cancer and to mimic human hormones, part of a chemical class known as endocrine disruptors, which over time cause reproductive disorders.
So pymetrozone and some of these other chemicals that you'll see mentioned in this list, let's take a quick moment to note that California doesn't require that a lot of these companies actually test for these chemicals. So in sense, this article is really combining 2 different testing panels.
Yes.
The California panel, by which all of these companies are expected to adhere to, and then the federal tobacco panel, which really comes out of left field. Nobody required or asked these companies to check for these chemicals, and even as a lab who tests for California, we don't even have those chemicals in-house to check by, because why would we add more chemicals and more time to somebody's already streamlined needs? So that's, it's an interesting way that they approach this by really outlining that there are certain chemicals that aren't inside of cannabis.
I think that's a really important factor for everyone watching this to really consider and know when to tell how you're being, if you are or aren't being gaslit or not. Because one of the things in regards to this is I can understand why they would want to have this standard put in place, because they're like, hey, everyone knows that cigarettes are terrible for you, so if they go off of that standard, then if something isn't allowed in cigarettes, then it must be extremely terrible for you.
That's a good way of looking at it, and at the same time, consider that how you have to test for certain chemicals in cannabis will be unique to cannabis. So to take something that's a tobacco testing standard and apply it to cannabis without what we would consider to be proper method development, because you don't test those 2 things the same way, generally speaking, and without proper standardization is kind of missing the mark on providing real strong core data. And so, yes, just like what you said, be very skeptical about 100% of the information that's being reported here, although the California testing panel is a real deal, and the products all here in the state of California are all expected to adhere to that.
Got it. Pymetrozine is approved for only limited use by the federal EPA and is banned in the UK, Canada, and Norway. A pink acai vape from Stizzy, the state's top-selling cannabis brand, carried more than 60 times the maximum amount of pyrimethamine allowed by federal regulators in cigarettes. But because California does not require testing for pyrimethamine, the company that makes Stizzy products said it is not in violation of state regulation. I would actually agree with them on that. In a quote, "We adhere to all standards and limits set by the state of California, which has some of the strictest testing requirements and pesticide limits in the country," Stizzy president Tak Sato said in an email. The Times and Weed Week testing also found other off-list chemical propagate, a carcinogenic insecticide that UCLA researchers have linked to brain cell death and increased incidence of Parkinson's disease in Central Valley residents. It showed up in some vapes at nearly 3 times what is permitted in cigarettes. And slipping into the legal supply, oh man, you guys, the state's unlicensed cannabis operations remain a primary source of concern. Deadly carboflavin and methylphenidose, is that right?
Methamidophos.
Methamidophos, banned insecticides usually smuggled from Mexico, continue to appear across California. Well, that's because we have a big open border. State Department of Fish and Wildlife, Regional Water Board, and county investigative records showed on a Trinity County farm in 2023, an environmental health report shows officers found a 3-pound tin of, what's that, Nate?
Fumitoxin. Fumitoxin.
Fumitoxin, a poison that emits
phosgene. Oh wait, no. You know what?
Phosgene, phosgene gas. Along with evidence, workers there were suffering severe diarrhea from exposure.
Oof.
The chemicals occasionally turn up in the legal market. One being
Methamidophos.
Methamidophos was detected in January and dried cannabis at a Van Nuys manufacturer, along with evidence the company was shipping the product across the country. Its license was ultimately then revoked. Interviews, confidential lab reports, and public agency records now also show a surge in pesticides smuggled from China that contain chemicals not permitted in the United States nor screened for in legal weed. These unmonitored chemicals are so toxic, California advised cannabis enforcement agents to wear hazmat suits and respirators during field inspections and to undergo annual blood poisoning tests. In a quote, repeated inhalation of pesticide residues through regular smoking or vaping is quite concerning, as this is a relatively direct route of exposure into the bloodstream, said Kimberly Paul, an epidemiologist and assistant professor at neurology at UCLA Medical Center. She was the lead researcher on the Central Valley study. Low-level pesticide residues are something to be concerned about, she says. National Health Survey by the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration show those between the ages of 18 and 25 make up the largest part of the market. More than 40% of young adults used cannabis within the last year. Separate studies by the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research show 1 out of 3 high school seniors last year used cannabis, 2/3 of them by vaping. Despite state laws against marketing to children, many brands reflect this youth appeal, from weed bags modeled after McDonald's Happy Meals to vape flavorings that mimic bubble gum. Now, we want to pause right there for a second, because I think ultimately, the actual vape companies are more responsible for this. Like the Altrias of the world and whatnot.
Strong agree on that one.
Yeah.
In our industry, I tend to see a lot more of the market focusing on natural cannabis flavors, and much less so on those kind of candy flavors or even immature approaches. I mean, this is coming from a dude in his 40s, but I see very few products that look like they're trying to market to children or anything cartoony, Happy Meal-like.
Yeah, I'm not really sure exactly what they're referring to in this, because I would not have used the reference of Happy Meals in my thought of cannabis packaging, but nonetheless,
no, not at all.
Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, I guess, right? And
of course, I'd
we
like
didn't
to
write
see
the article.
And I'd like to see, I guess, an example just to understand what else could be out there. But
Yeah.
on the far and wide, most of what I see looks like it's made by adults for adults. That's the feel I get from walking into a dispensary.
Same on my side. Same on my side. But nonetheless, they say the risk for medical users is pesticides, which are designed to kill living organisms, have their place in agriculture. Regulation is focused on limiting contact exposure to agriculture workers and residues lingering on fruits and vegetables at the market. Tolerance taken into account the body's ability to filter toxins through the liver, you guys. Smoking and vaping, however, deliver chemicals directly to the lungs, into the blood and the brain. The only other consumer product intended for smoking in this country is tobacco. Rather than demand pesticide inhalation studies for tobacco, the EPA decades ago decided smoking itself is so carcinogenic as to eclipse other health threats. The agency thus set a universal cap for tobacco contaminants at a 0.1% part per million before requiring determination of health impacts, a standard California used to set limits for many chemicals in cannabis.
So to be clear there, that point is what we have there for 0.01 parts per million area. We're talking about 0.01 micrograms per gram, about 10 parts per billion is all. So what they're essentially saying there is they set a standard where they'll ignore anything below that, which makes sense. Anything below 10 parts per billion sounds pretty minimal right there, correct?
Yeah, and
so,
as you can see the graphic.
And essentially all of the standards for what we search for start from that point and above. So even the category 1 products, for the most part, if they're below that point, it would be considered non-detectable.
Interesting. And you guys can see all of those on this chart right here, over somewhere here, there, wherever it is. It's somewhere. But nonetheless, moving on, Arizona State University toxicologist Max Leung, who was part of the state team that in 2017 advised California cannabis regulators on pesticide risks, said the pesticide threats are greater for medical marijuana users with epilepsy, Parkinson's, and other neurological disorders. But Leung said the lack of federal recognition of cannabis's widespread use, whether state or sanctioned or not, has left consumers vulnerable. There is a lack of data on health impacts experienced by cannabis users, though some states do not solicit health complaints from the public, and in a few cases, those have led to product recalls for pesticides. California does not collect such information, you guys. Rather than uninformed national health standards, Leung and his team found a patchwork of desperate state regulations. Different pesticides capped at different levels or not capped at all, he said. In a quote, "You've got all this contamination, but what do they do?" Leung said. "There's just no research." After the passage of Proposition 64 created a legal adult use market in California, toxicologists with the Department of Pesticide Regulation proposed to ban from inhaled weed products 42 chemicals the agency said are harmful to people, the environment, or water, according to a copy of the March 2017 proposal. The limits were rejected amid industry concerns about testing costs and lab capacity. Now that is a big deal right there. They're basically saying, you know what, screw your health. Our labs can't do it, but we still want to mandate it. And because we can't make our labs do it, we're just going to let you guys suffer at the wayside.
This just a slight tangent is it makes me think of all of the things and concessions that are made to our health as part of just simply making products marketable and commercially available to produce, right? In this sense, the notion that there are massive numbers of products. Of course, this article has only dealt with cannabis and in some interesting ways the testing for tobacco products. That's not to say that your food is absent of any of these things, and for what it's worth, in much higher numbers. It's if one were to take this same lens and shine it at the food industry, astonishing things would happen.
Oh, I totally agree with you on that, because the reality is that our cannabis is tested at much stricter rates than all of our food is, and every human being consumes food. Not every human being consumes cannabis. That is an important
They do make a point
distinction.
that there is a much more direct, for some types of cannabis use, smoking for instance, a much more direct to blood type of pathway for something like a smoked product. But regardless, a lot of cannabis users will use this transdermally or via edibles or so on and so forth. And this is a much larger conversation too. If we are going to compare apples to apples, you'd be astonished at the reduction in heavy metals and pesticides you would find, for instance, in cannabis edibles compared to mass market products.
Interesting. And moving right along, 6 months later, the pesticide agency returned with more relaxed rules. It cut the zero tolerance list by half to 21 chemicals and set limits for 45 other pesticides on par with tobacco standards. Manufacturers of products that failed screening can attempt to lower the pesticide levels, such as by dilution, or incorporate the weed into edibles where higher levels are tolerated. If they fail again, according to the state regulation, the batches must be destroyed, and that's exactly what Nate just alluded to. Pesticide agency records, including interagency memos and emails, show that since 2018, despite repeated requests, cannabis regulators have not updated the list of chemicals that weed is tested for. Even after pesticide regulators made a direct appeal to the governor's cannabis advisor, Nicole Elliott. In January, the Department of Cannabis Control, which Elliott now heads, said it was working to update those regulations, but as of June, no changes had been proposed. State toxicologists have also been stymied by taking a more active role in protecting the public from cannabis pesticides. California's Department of Pesticide Regulation conducts some of the nation's most sophisticated evaluation of pesticide exposure to the public. It even has an employee whose job title is, that's right in quotes you guys, Cannabis and Hemp Program Manager. But when it comes to cannabis, a spokesperson for the pesticide agency said responsibility for protecting consumers rests solely within the Department of Cannabis Control. That's just like them to just pass the buck. But the pesticide regulatory did try early on to draft their own public health advisories for cannabis, but those were never issued. The agency released copies of 6 under a public records request and would not say how many more existed. One of those advisors was for piperonal
butoxide.
Piperonal butoxide contamination in cannabis. It was among the chemicals that the Times and Weed Week found in the testing that they conducted.
May I mention real quick regarding piperonal butoxide, not considered all the time a pesticide, oftentimes a pesticide synergist, helping the effectiveness of pesticides. It's associated, formulated
so it's like a steroid.
Sort of, yeah.
Okay.
In this case, one of the chemicals that has the highest threshold, the highest action limit, if you will, the allowable amount of that chemical prior to coming to a fail. Off the top of my head, I think you're allowed for 0.5% of your product to be piperonal butoxide before action is taken. And that's a lot. You know, 1% of your product's a lot. Half of 1% is still a lot. And so that is, just to throw it out there. Now we can consider, of course, some of these concerns and some of these symptoms that we're about to run through. But do bear in mind of how generally regarded as safe in that certain way, up to certain amounts, this particular chemical is considered as very much given example by the high amounts that are allowed in a product by the state regulations.
Moving right along, in a quote, acute toxicity symptoms may include tearing, drooling, runny nose, congestion, and difficulty breathing. The unreleased advisory read it added that the laboratory animals exposed to the pesticide had more miscarriages and produced offspring with fingers and toes that were sometimes fused together. In 2019, toxicologists in the Department of Pesticide Regulation tried but did not succeed in launching a program to monitor chemicals being used in the illicit market. Internal memos from the 2021 show that those same toxicologists who were barred from seeing data collected from product safety tests, making it impossible for them to monitor what was circulating within the legal market. There is no easy way in California to trace contamination. The state does not investigate the sources of pesticides in cannabis goods, but instead relies on a system of paper trails, seed to sale, inventories, and lab testing certificates to protect the public. Tests for the Times and Weed Week showed repeated contamination in small batches of vapes stamped with the unique tracking number of a Van Nuys manufacturer, David Shin. Among them were Backpack Boys carts with as many as 24 pesticides, half of those above state safety limits and including
chlorphenapyr,
prohibited by the amount at 2,000 times the above minimum detection level.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah. The bulk oil for these vapes originated from cannabis grown on a single Central Valley farm. Shin said he bought the oil through a broker and did no independent testing of his own.
Which is very common because although products that are directed towards retailers are very much needing testing prior to being able to be transferred to the retailers.
Yeah.
There are no B2B testing regulations, no requirements. It's you're out to the wolves whether or not something's actually being tested B2B.
And in the state side and not requiring that I think that is kind of their way of keeping prices low, so then that way the cost of those goods don't go up through other test fees. But also at the same time, I think they feel that that because it has to go out and once it's in a final form, that's kind of the threshold of where it goes to the customer, and then that way the onus is on the business to not be doing business with bad actors.
Makes good sense. And essentially, I mean, regardless of intention, that's what's essentially been created. So you're dead on with that dynamic.
Moving right along. He flavored and packaged the vapes, and a state-certified lab declared the products pesticide-free. They were then distributed by a wholesaler to Backpack Boys dispensaries across the state. Alerted to the pesticides found by the Times and Weed Week, Shin said he could not unravel the source of the contamination. A manager for the wholesaler said the company was launching its own internal investigation. The owners of Backpack Boys LLC, which holds no cannabis license, did not respond for comment, you guys. The problem with cannabis trim. Oh, that's a big one, you guys. The THC oil that fills vape pens is extracted from biomass, plant material made up of lower potency leaves and stalks left at harvest, moldy flower, and even high quality buds that sit too long. Harsh chemicals and extreme temperatures in the extraction process can destroy a few pesticides, but most pesticides become more concentrated. That makes vapes more likely than select flowers to exceed safe limits. Now, I know you have something to say in regards with this, Nate.
It's normal to see these things. Now, it is worth mentioning that a lot of vapes out there are going through a real thorough refining process, and if there was something wrong with them like moldiness, all that's really left after this refinement is just the cannabinoids. There are other products that are intending to be high quality single source that no way could you get away with that because the molds in themselves and the flavors would carry over to the final product. It is something worth mentioning though that if you do consider mass market products, let's just put it this way, the apples that go into your applesauce might not be the apples you'd be comfortable eating had they not been sauced.
Fair point.
That is in a lot of ways what they're essentially talking about, and it's not a bad thing to bring it to light. But it is worth mentioning that the oranges that go into your orange juice, the apples that go into your applesauce may not have been shelf worthy. And in some ways they're pointing out that cannabis is no different.
Now, I have a question. It says in here that that some of these pesticides or contaminants can be destroyed through the manufacturing process. Now, when those are destroyed, is it possible that there's some type of residue that can build up in these machines over time that ultimately could cause a negative test result?
It does depend on the process. If we're talking about something that is a fairly gentle process that doesn't go through that many steps of refinement, it is possible that you can get a residual pesticide effect between batches and there be cross-contamination, either on the instrument, the lab, or through the solvent, or more than likely all of the above. And that can, between batches or from batch to batch, ultimately pick up a whole sort of grounding of pesticides, and at the same time, the opportunities for contamination run rampant. It's just a what-if kind of scenario, but something that very much can happen in the extraction world.
So it is possible that some of the products that are listed on the list today that you'll be seeing in just a little while could possibly have been contaminated due to the machinery that it was processed in, as opposed to it actually being contaminated product at the start source.
Correct. In other words, the flour may not have been contaminated, but cross-contamination, bad practice at an extraction lab can absolutely lead to
Just want to make sure that we're being fair to everyone throughout this process.
I want to say that in this article it mentions certain products having veritable rainbows of contamination, dozens of different contaminants found. More than likely that came from the same type of cross-contamination. There's things that, because very infrequently would you find that many pesticides used on one product. You don't need to. So the idea that something can just be completely unhinged and being picked up from multiple sources is totally a reality.
Well, the rise of these intensive cultivation practices, densely planted greenhouses and industrial warehouses with sea of green crops supported by netting, invites infestors of whiteflies, spider mites, and mold. Clean cannabis can be commercially grown, but it requires time and care, said Sam Feliciano, a former pest control manager for a high-end Los Angeles brand, Maven Industries. It is cheaper and faster to douse high-value crops with chemicals, which is what Feliciano and other workers allege in a civil lawsuit that they were ordered to do at Maven. And we have another graphic up for you guys. In a quote, he says, "I didn't want to upset them and tell them, no, it's not okay to do that stuff," Feliciano said. "They simply would have just got rid of me," Feliciano alleged in the civil suit that he suffered bouts of nausea, disorientation, and confusion brought on by cannabis pesticide treatments. He told The Times that because of the impact to his health, he decided to quit. The workers in November were ordered to have their complaints heard by a private arbitrator. By email, Maven Industries chief executive David Bosworth declined to comment on the lawsuit, but asserted the company's products are, in quotes, are certified and safe, and are in fact safe for consumer use. Legalization has also brought large-scale cultivation out of the mountains and into agricultural areas, including Central Valley farmlands, where airborne pesticides drift from almond groves and grape vineyards. At the same time, the explosion in vape sales have created heavy demand for distillate. California vape sales tripled from 2020 to 2023 to become a $1.4 billion market, and now only slightly trail those of packaged flower. To feed this demand, bulk oil manufacturers seek out lower quality weed, much of it contaminated, to buy at discounted rates. To meet state screening limits, the extracted oils or distillates are blended to dilute pesticides. One manufacturer who solicits farmers for, in quotes, dirty weed, defended the practice, saying he provided struggling growers an income source while keeping otherwise unsellable cannabis out of the landfill. The amber-colored bulk oil moves on an opaque market, traded by brokers who operate without licenses or regulation. It is bought by manufacturers who sometimes will use oil from same batches to fill thousands of vape cartridges for competing brands. This cheap commodity oil now dominates the market, selling for a fraction of the cost to produce a clean product. The cannabis industry's reliance on low-quality weed enrages old-style farmers such as Mary Gartrude, who nurtures her sun-grown plants on a Humboldt County farmstead that has been her principal means of support for decades. She is offended by the pleas she regularly receives from those seeking, in quotes, old, moldy, or even dirty trim, as a San Luis Obispo distributor put in a text to her back in February. A Humboldt buyer with "turn that trash into cash" in the subject line asked for trim with all levels of pesticides and heavy metals. In a quote, "The people who are doing it right get crushed," she said. "The bad actors are encouraged and rewarded, and the consumers are poisoned while being told they are safe."
If I may, that practice isn't very far from what you'd see on mass agriculture. The corn that gets turned into ethanol is going to see untold levels of torture, chemically and by pests before being turned into ethanol, because at the end of the day, if, I don't want to ever downplay anybody's hard effort, but most of what made it corn has been stripped away, and chemically we're only using a small portion of it in order to make it into that ethanol. The notion that we can have products out there that are absolutely tortured but go into a certain category of product is something that far exceeds our lifetime. There's such thing, and I don't want to overlook it ever because it's such a big part of our industry, the difference between mass manufactured product and small batch product. And something easy to picture because it exists everything from alcohol to fruits and vegetables.
Very, very true.
I really want to just kind of point out that you have the idea of mass market products that are always going to get affected in the worst ways in a lot of what they've explained there, but no way is that unique to cannabis.
Fair enough, but coming up next, we have everyone's favorite part of a story, because there's some weed whistleblowers, you guys. That's right, back in February of 2022, a group of California cannabis testing labs upset about what they believed was widespread fraud in weed potency claims decided to force regulations into action. They formed a blind round robin, each lab testing retail flower samples without knowing whose work they were checking. In the course of testing for potency, one batch of flower was found to contain 3 times the allowed level of pyrethians. Cannabis regulators were alerted but issued no recall. In fact, it wasn't until the end of 2023, 6 years after adult use sales became legal, that California sought to remove a product for pesticide contamination, according to the agency's published recalls. When cannabis was first legalized, labs rushed to be licensed to capitalize on the expanding market. But labs with stringent testing methods and expensive equipment complained to the state of losing customers to operators that promised high potency results or had track records for approving most products. In a quote, "There's no checks and balances to make sure no one's doing something wrong when they're not being watched," said Swider of Infinite Chemical Analysis Labs. Also says, "That's all we've ever asked for. I don't want to be the judge, jury, and executioner. I just want to let everyone be treated fairly," he says. Swider embarked on doing what regulators were not, testing weed specifically for pesticides. He ultimately sent cannabis regulators 77 complaints about pesticide contamination he found in tests conducted from last October through May. The complaints included Zope flower, sold by Grizzly Peak Farms, and Crew Mai Tai vape carts, both with chlorophenopure prohibited at any detectable level. Fog City Farms shark bites with too much
Piperonal butoxide and spiromesiphin.
West Coast Cure biscotti vapes with
Myclobutanol, aka Eagle 20,
and Jack Herrera flavored ones with
Chlorphenapyr, Paclobutrazol, aka Phospholode, bifenazate, and trifloxystrobin.
and Backpack Boys vapes contained
Chlorphenapyr, bifenazate, bifenthrin, etoxazole, I never get that one, etoxazole, malathion, myclobutanol, pyperonal butoxide, pyrethrins, and spiromesiphin.
Most of the manufacturers told reporters they were unaware of contamination because their product had not been certified as safe by private labs. It took 41 days from receiving Swider's complaint for regulators to announce California's first ever pesticide recall of a cannabis product, the Zope flower sold by Grizzly Peak Farms, the lab that had cleared the product for market. Pro Pharma Labs also lost its license, but regulators took no action against those who grew the weed. A cultivation arm of the Colas brand tested for the Times and Weed Week showed Zope sold under a Koala's label also were contaminated for?
That's chlorphenapyr.
Chlorphenapyr, that's right. Kevin McCarty, owner of Sacramento-based King Holdings, which grew the Zope strain, said no zero-tolerance pesticides were used in its cultivation and the cannabis had been certified by a state-licensed labs. The Department of Cannabis Control has not initiated any additional recalls involving us, and we have no additional comment, McCarthy wrote via email. The Department of Cannabis Control's second pesticide recall came in January, 8 weeks after Swindler's tip-off. The affected Fog City pre-rolls were nearly sold out by the time the public was alerted back in January. 4 flavors of Fat Panda vapes were also voluntarily removed from sale for what regulators told consumers was a labeling mistake, despite outside tests that showed dangerous levels of
That's malathion.
Malathion. California issued a no pesticide warning since. Swider's test found that 19 varieties of vapes by California's 4th largest brand, West Coast Cure, carried a large amount of illegal pesticide loads. After learning of those results, operators of a San Francisco-based lab and Resco undertook their own tests and also noted California regulators of pesticides in 8 West Coast Cure products. Sarah Odos, and Resico's director of quality assurance, said regulators asked for re-aims of supporting data, then refused to say whether they would act on the information. In a quote, "Now that we know there's contaminated product on the market, like what? What do we do with that?" she asked. And Resco also agreed to test products for the Times and Weed Week, as did a Santa Cruz-based cannabis testing company, SC Labs. Reports brought products from dispensaries across the state, choosing some that were the subject of complaints and others at random. The results confirmed Swider's findings and identified additional contaminated products. Some goods violated state limits for a single chemical. Others, such as vapes by West Coast Cure and Backpack Boys, contained dozens of undisclosed pesticides. Do you want to touch on that for a moment, Nate?
Oh, where does it begin? There were... I want to understand this from other angles, other than just as a testing lab. Because from the point of view as a testing lab, there are, when they mention undisclosed pesticides, I'm wondering if that's the non-California ones that are being referred to.
Yeah, I'm assuming that those are the tobacco
or if
ones.
These are ones that the testing lab didn't disclose, that they may have found or maybe didn't have the ability to find.
Interesting.
So I have questions that might only sort of confound some of those points that we heard made. I would like to hear the perspectives, though, of from the consumer end and stuff like that, how it does sound, because in this sense, it sounds like it's being suggested that there's uncertainty in the testing industry, which normally I would want to help shine a light on as much as possible. But I am concerned about, again, the presence of using chemicals as part of this article that aren't necessarily considered by the California panel, and how that might create some form of consumer confusion. So in that sense, I'm almost a little uncertain about what to do with this information, you know what I mean? I like the idea that they may be shining a light, just in case, on how there may be other chemicals that should be on the California panel, at which point we would start to, us and the state would start to enter, I imagine, into levels of method development to be able to detect those chemicals, as well as the 66 we're already doing. But in that sense, I like that as a overall battle cry, but that seems like a different article to me.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Continuing on, manufacturers universally defended their products and cast doubt on the lab testing industry because manufacturers responded in ways with quotes such as, "We've invested millions of dollars to build our businesses in compliance with California laws and regulations. We firmly advocate for the stringent testing mandated by the state to guarantee the safety and excellence of our products," said Logan Wasserman, the CEO of West Coast Cure's parent company, Shield Management Group. He contended that responsibility for ensuring product safety was on the labs that declared his vapes pesticide-free. The Department of Cannabis Control issued no public recalls of West Coast Cure products, but did conduct a surprise inspection at its Long Beach facility. In early May, the agency levied a $3.2 million fine against Wasserman's company, saying it failed to guard against product tampering, including storing goods in the parking lot in shipping containers that had no security cameras. It was also cited for failing to provide legally required video proving that section of product samples for lab testing was not rigged. Wasserman did not respond to questions about the citations, and directors of labs that had certified products cited as contaminated in Swider's crusade accused him of seeking a competitive edge, even spiking pesticides into clean samples. They accused clients of having clean material tested and sending contaminated goods to market. None made these statements on the record, and they cited fear of lost business, litigation, and personal harm. They also said pesticide testing is inexact and easily manipulated. In a quote, "You could give it to 10 different labs and get 10 different results," said Paul Hamra, owner of Verity Analytics, the San Diego lab that approved vapes by West Coast Cure, Fat Panda, and Maven that subsequently showed pesticides. Hamra asserted that those testing products for the Times and Weed Week tampered with the results as part of an elaborate smear campaign, he says in quotation marks. The labs denied the allegation, and state inspectors visited Hamra's lab in January, in quotes, "trying to shut us down because of cases made against us by Infinite," Hamrash said. In late April, the state suspended Verity Analytics license, saying the lab, in quotes, has engaged in activity that poses harm to public health, safety, or welfare. The suspension, reviewed by the Times and Weed Week, said Verity inflated potency of 4 cannabis products, failed to show accreditation, and could not provide the chemical standards it used to check calibration, and told regulators it had unacceptable accuracy ratings for testing pesticides, molds, and solvents. Inspectors also said Verity labeled a pesticide known as a non-detect when equipment showed contamination without offering any scientific criteria. Oh, Nate, what do you have to say about this?
I'm familiar with a list that the state published just a few short weeks ago on the discrepancies seen with Verity on their inspections, and you know, there was, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this, you know, in the most diplomatic sense.
I'll just speak to the people.
But in this sense, there didn't seem to be much science going on.
So it was a bunch of bro science.
It would have been better if the state said it was a bunch of bro science. Let's just, what?
Fair enough.
I like that standard. Had the state said it was a bunch of bro science, the outlook would have been about 6 times better than what they actually published.
And we probably would have had a different headline too.
It's, a lot of the samples on this list came from that lab. And it's an interesting quote that was given to us that suggests that you could give the same result to 10 different labs and receive 10 different results. Yes-ish, because of the lack of standardization, but I can tell you that if it's a pesticide hit from another lab saw it, chances are 99.99 out of 100 that I'm going to see the exact same pesticide in roughly the same amounts. You could suggest that difference may even exist because you have a slightly different sample group and because pesticide contamination isn't perfectly homogeneous. Like a spray will have hot spots, for instance. And so in that sense, you'll find it no matter what, maybe in slightly different amounts, but I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. You could take 10 not so well-to-do labs and they'll give you 10 different results. But again, if there's a testing lab that knows what they're doing, that intends to produce correct results, they're going to see that. And it's not really a question of when a pesticide was used. That's pretty bad information.
Fair enough. Hammer said what inspectors took to be pesticide hit was instead instrument noise, in quotation marks, in a quote.
Suggests that the instrument wasn't working properly, or it was dirty, or there was some type of lack of being able to have a clear signal of data that would tell you that
Be able to get a clear and
pesticide
accurate
there.
reading.
Which in some cases it is a real thing, but if you really had that much confounding information, you would retest it. And if you can't actually produce sample results that are accurate without noise, you shouldn't be publishing those results. Scientifically, you don't have the means to. That's what I would get from that.
Got it. In a quote, he says, "I am determined to prove my lab is a victim of a grand and elaborate frame job by several labs because they couldn't compete with us," he said. "We were expanding and they got scared." Meanwhile, Swider became a target. He said he lost clients as word of his activism spread. Then, while traveling in March, Swider received a cell phone call from a blocked number. We all know blocked numbers are never good to get on a phone call. In a quote, "I'm going to come and get you and your whole family," the caller said. "You're going to pay for this." "It makes me want him to get out of the cannabis industry," said his wife, Kayla Swider. "He's like that. What would I do?" she says. In late May, Swider filed one more round of complaints with the Department of Cannabis Control, alerting the agency to excessive pesticides in 16 products, some of them subject of prior complaints, but still for sale. Days later, he received an email from the agency, and it was sending inspectors to audit his lab. That's right, you guys. Cannabis regulators, swooped in because California Business and Professional Code 26011.5 is explicit about the mission of the state cannabis regulatory agency. The protection of the public shall be the highest priority. Whenever the protection of the public is inconsistent with other interests sought to be promoted, the protection of the public shall be paramount. In industry presentations, Nicole Elliott, the Department of Cannabis Control Director, often identifies the challenges facing California cannabis as economic. Her economic chief, among her concerns, she told the National Cannabis Industry Association in February, which is a large swath of California that prohibits dispensaries. These cannabis deserts, as Elliott calls them, are the greatest constraint to scalability or expansion of California's legal market. To drive business to licensed dispensaries, Elliott's agency conceived the Real California Cannabis Campaign. In a quote, "We know we have a good amount of consumption from the illegal market. We know there's an opportunity through education to shift some behavior to the legal market, Elliott told the trade group. The social media campaign launched back in February and included ads targeted at seniors, among others, because polling showed they were most swayed by safety messages. Gee, I wonder why the state is just gaslighting them. The catchphrases promoting legal weed include the good stuff and quality you can trust. The belief that any cannabis product carrying a certificate of analysis or COA is safe is foundational for dispensary owners. And in an additional quote, "We will not accept it if it does not have a COA," said Dave Sassoon, a board member of Foothills Health and Wellness, a legacy dispensary that over 2 decades has earned the trust of medical providers who send cancer patients to the store in Shingle Springs, east of Sacramento.
To be perfectly clear, that's part of regulations. As a dispensary, you're required to have a book of all COAs for matching all the products on your shelf.
Very true about that. I know that as a retailer, that's 100% factual information. And to learn some of these certified products carry pesticides, Sassoon said in a quote, "It's absolutely terrible. These are medically compromised people. They have to be very, very careful of what they put into their body." As a retailer, I'm sitting in this reality strange position where everything comes to me safe and tested, said the owner of a multi-county dispensary chain, speaking anonymously because of concern of being tied to bad publicity for the struggling legal industry. But in a quote says, "But it's so crazy that we're operating in a system where many are gaming it." Elliott declined to be interviewed on the extent of the pesticide threat, and her agency selectively responded to requests for public records and refused to release records regarding policies on pesticide contamination. It contended that it conducts random testing of products for sale to consumers. And behind the scenes, internal records showed the cannabis agency, as early as late February, sent buyers into the fled to obtain products on Swider's list. They remained stockpiled for months while the department worked to get its Richmond lab able only to test potency and check for mold. Accredited to run pesticide screens as of early June, accreditation records showed the lab was still not ready, and most of the products flagged for contamination had sold out. On Monday, a spokesperson said the regulatory agency would not be able to begin tests on consumer products collected from store shelves by the following week. Other agencies in the Newsom administration also refused to release cannabis-related records. The Department of Fish and Wildlife provided partial summaries, but no records of pesticides encountered by its agents on raids. The Department of Toxic Substances Control and its reports on pesticides encountered on cannabis sites were confidential, and the Department of Pesticide Regulation over 8 months released only partial records that hinted at the extensive work its staff had undertaken to address pesticide-tainted weed. Department of Cannabis Control employees who spoke on condition of anonymity complained of a lack of willingness within the agency to take a hard line on pesticide contamination. One said she was schooled on the importance of, in quotes, not disrupting the market.
That's interesting.
Very interesting. In January, as the Times and Weed Week began asking questions regarding its handling of licensed cannabis products, the agency launched a series of product recalls, not for pesticides, but for mold and misleading potency claims.
Which, just to be clear, all of these are issues.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not like the light should be shined on one versus another. All of the above, not to complain that the article has that direction, but just to, for the viewers, these are all concerns.
Yeah, fair enough.
All things that need to be looked at.
Fair enough. The department also asked the legislature for an $8.2 million budget increase, seeking to hire more enforcement lawyers and laboratory staff to develop testing protocols. Within 48 hours of being provided the findings of this story for response, the deputy director of lab services left. No public reason for the departure was given. And a day later, speaking to the National Cannabis Industry Association, Nicole Elliott emphasized her concern for public health. In a quote, she says, "My roadmap isn't about preserving what is, it's about creating what is best for consumers, for the general public," she said. "That's sort of my North Star," she says. And we have another graphic up here for you on how dirty is your weed, you guys. This is a lot to show. So these are results of pesticide tests on legal cannabis, all vape products except where noted. Pesticide levels are given in relation to California cannabis or federal tobacco limits. An X test result means the levels exceeded those limits, and the warning sign denotes lower levels of pesticides detected, and a check mark represents no pesticides were detected. As you see, this is a comprehensive list of all of the products that were tested within this report. Not all brands had the same number of SKUs tested in relation to all of the brands. And in the case of extraction labs, it highlights the need for ethical testing to maintain chemical control of the biomass they'll be extracting. There's high chances of cross-contamination between batches, and seemingly small or invisible amounts of pesticides can have their presence exacerbated through the extraction process. You have any final thoughts on this, Nate?
No, thank you for covering this all and making this important. This is, in all areas, needs to be discussed. The notion that I think that from the point of view of the companies, that there can be an alternative to getting your results from a well-to-do lab is possibly the most damaging thing to be taken from this. You know, if you have a failing batch, what would be somebody's thought? Would it be that their company and their payroll and their heart and soul went into this, and that the most important thing is preserving their company and preserving their employees and being able to pay them, and all of their hard work continues to go forward? Or is it to throw in the towel because you weren't able to make cannabis that was pesticide free? You know, what is the reality here? And that's, I hate to be an executioner kind of position, because, you know, what is that cutoff for where somebody could or should be allowed to participate in the industry? Generally spoken, though, you can say that at least from the consumer standpoint, this would be taken for granted. Of course, labs are seen as this version of perfection. Of course, lab testing can't go anywhere other than perfectly accurate. And of course, you know, nobody's trying to game the system. If they can't produce good cannabis, well, better luck next season, right? But we see here, and in an all too real way, that's not the case of our fledgling industry. And I could talk for hours on that next idea, and let's just kind of use that as a springboard for a future discussion.
Fair enough. We will be having Nate back with us for future conversations in regards with testing. And I do want to thank you, Nate Winokur of Bell Costa Labs, based right here in Long Beach, California, for joining us for this special report on how safe is your cannabis you consume. Thank you to Weed Week and the LA Times for producing this report, and thank you for tuning in to this Sunday special report on High at 9 News. I'm your host, Jason Beck. Have a great rest of your Sunday, everyone, and please make sure to smash that like button on your way out if you haven't already, and make sure to tune in to High at 9 News every Monday through Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific and high noon on the East Coast. We are America's #1 daily cannabis news show.
Thanks for having me, brother.
Yes, sir. Most definitely.